Thank you for joining us for the Power of Storytelling webinar. Whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are, your presence here matters. My name is John Picard, and I'm honored to moderate today's event. The series is proudly hosted by the Colombo Plan, the International Society for Substance Use Professionals, ISSUP, Faces and Voices of Recovery, and the Global Recovery Network. These organizations are working together to strengthen recovery systems worldwide. While we are waiting for a few more of us to join, I will begin by saying a little about ISSUP, a membership organization for the global substance use workforce with over 35,000 members worldwide. It is an international network that unites, connects, and shares knowledge across the substance use prevention, harm reduction, treatment, and recovery support workforce. ISSUP's global mission is to make the work of members as impactful, accessible, and effective as possible. They do this by making it easier to discover and share evidence-based knowledge, best practices, training, and network opportunities. If you've not already done so, please head over to ISSUP's website, issup.net, that's isup.net, where you will find information on how to sign up for a free membership. The website also has a wealth of resources and publications for you to enjoy. And you can watch recordings of past webinars and see future event listings. So I'd like to thank the ISSUP staff for providing technical support for this webinar. Sorry that we're running a little bit late, but as somebody who is in IT, tech problems sometimes happen, but we've corrected them and we're working through it. This is a six-part series taking place over every other Tuesday. Unfortunately, this one was delayed by a week, but we're glad you all can join us today. So we're going to conclude on September 30th, which is International Recovery Day. Each phase of the series focuses on building knowledge and capacity across three areas: core foundations of recovery, returning to basics, and leadership development. Today's session completes our returning to basics phase. So today, we journey into the power of storytelling. And we had a quick replacement. Unfortunately, our first presenter, Shonda Santana, who's incredible, is being replaced by another incredible presenter, Joseph Sanchez. A very warm welcome to you, and it is a great pleasure to have you with us today, Joseph. So Joseph began working in the recovery field after joining the continuation and development team with the Recovery Alliance of El Paso, the recovery community organization that assisted him in his own recovery. Joseph celebrates the commencement of his recovery on October 2, 2005. As a distinguished graduate of the 2009 Leadership Institute for Recovery Support Service Emerging Leaders, Joseph has championed local, state, and national peer-based initiatives through active mentorship and servant leadership. In addition to his work with the recovery community, Joseph is committed to reaching out to the LGBTQIA+ communities to eliminate homophobia and heterosexism. As a person living with HIV since 2003, his courage lends a face and voice for individuals with HIV and AIDS, as well as the millions of Americans living with substance use disorders. A passionate advocate for recovery, Joseph inspires others to view systems of care through a lens of hope and change, always embracing his personal mission statement to inspire positive thinking and forward movement through motivation, education, and empowerment. So before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Today's session is in English with interpretation available in Spanish. Please check for the link in the chat to access the Spanish interpretation. This session will be recorded and you'll receive the slides, video, and resources via email after the session. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to our presenter by typing your questions into the questions panel of the webinar interface on your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So now, it is my pleasure to hand over this webinar to my friend and our esteemed presenter, Joseph. The floor is yours.
Thank you all. Give me 1 second so I can share the correct screen. And hopefully that does it. John, are we good? I can only.
You're
Yep,
good, Joseph.
yep. Fantastic, and thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, and good day wherever you are. I am actually in Denver, Colorado, so it's just a little bit early in the morning. So getting my engines running, and nothing gets my engines revved up than talking about recovery, and more specifically, the opportunity to talk about storytelling in recovery. The great honor and privilege to be selected as a backup for Chanda, and hopefully I am able to carry the intent and message that she had planned to. And one of those learning, or some of those learning objectives, hopefully by the end of our training today, is to really delve into how narratives help individuals and communities heal and grow, as well as learning about ethical guidelines for storytelling. This is a critical part of our discussion: how to share stories in a way that is respectful and safe for everyone involved, as well as developing effective media engagement and speaking skills. We'll cover practical strategies for communicating your story to a broader audience, whether it's through a public forum or a media interview. And before I dive into the information, I'll say a little bit about myself. I know that John read my bio, um, but I wanted to tell you all that I am a person in recovery, and initiated that process back in 2005. And for me, recovery has given me the opportunity to be a loving son, a contributing member to my community, a loving partner, and a patient dog dad. I have two dogs. You might see them wiggle around in the back throughout the course of the time that we're together. And more importantly, as a person in recovery, being able to make an impact in the community, like just showing up. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that here soon. When we talk about the importance of storytelling, why is it important for recovery and in recovery? Well, first off, thinking about storytelling in general, a lot of us within our communities huddle around the kitchen or the fire or the water cooler, and during a break or during any kind of type of occasion, and we swap stories. We learn more about each other and the stories that we tell. And for recovery from substance use disorders and mental illness, it can have this uh, stigma on it. Nobody understands, or some folks may not understand it. They may have a picture of what it means to be a person with substance use disorder. And that picture may not be accurate. So when we tell our stories of recovery, of championing and getting back to a place of wellness, we start to humanize that recovery journey. We start to put a face and a voice, if you will, on what that looks like when we say that we are in recovery. So, of course, when somebody meets or has an idea or picture that may be false, may not hit the mark on what it looks like to be in recovery or what it looks like to live with substance use disorder, we're able to be that face, that voice, and reduce stigma. I always think about an American commercial, probably back in the 90s, and it is, they're trying to sell a certain dandruff shampoo. And the main character um, is a person that is living with, with dandruff, and their colleague says, "Oh, you should try this product," and the person says, "Well, how do you know about this product? You don't have dandruff." And that's the thing, is that yeah, they did, and they're telling that story and how they got to the other side of it. And the person evidently had in their mind an idea of what it looked like if somebody had dandruff, or suffered with or struggled with that. And now we start to look at, from a recovery aspect, you know, we don't look like someone with a substance use disorder if you have this, painted picture or idea in your head. And we start to reduce that stigma and those misconceptions, those misunderstandings, and sometimes the folks that may cause harm unintentionally with the words that they use. And now we start to chip away at that stigma. And really, it helps to build empathy and support within our community. Once people know, are familiar with, are colleagues with, are family members of, and they start to see people in recovery, people living with substance use disorder um, in their life, then they start to build this rapport. They start to build this sense of empathy. And with that, don't push people away. They start to create community and say, "Oh, wow, that's great." So they start to become so supportive of that. And most times, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, when I disclose that I'm a person in recovery, whether it's in a group setting or in a crowd, I usually have somebody kind of pull me aside after I talk and say, "Well, I have a family member that, or I have a friend that," and they start to disclose that they have this family member or this loved one that they might be struggling with substance use disorders or mental illness, and may ask how we did it, how we got help, how we got support. And that person starts to build community of support. It's just by me coming out about my recovery. Get me early in the morning, and unfortunately, early in the morning, I'm very congested. So bear with me as we get things revved up in my voice and in my sinuses. With with sharing our stories, with storytelling, we start to make a impact in our community, impact in our family, impact. It's like when you drop a water into a body, or drop a rock into a body of water, things start to ripple out. Change starts to ripple out. Community starts to strengthen. And so we start to strengthen these emotional connections by telling our story, and not like not focusing on all the horrible things that happened to us or that we did, or in the midst of our disease, but we start to talk about the hope. We start to talk about how life has changed, life has gotten better, and we start to strengthen these emotional connections with others. And for those that may be struggling in their lives, they start to have hope for that. We also start to enhance and empower those that might be living with substance use disorder and might be struggling with it. And we start to be that beacon of hope and resiliency. I know that a lot of folks, a lot of friends of mine that are in recovery themselves, have gone through really, really tough times when they were in active substance use. And to look at them now, beaming smiles from ear to ear, and just being that living example that, I went through that. That was what I went through. That was what I was struggling with. And today, it's no longer a struggle. Today, I'm able to show up in different ways, in different capacities, and be that resilient person and take that life experience that I had and apply it to life today and know that as long as I'm not there, it's a better day today. Wouldn't you agree? Also, promoting trust within communities. When we start to talk um, about recovery and what it means to us and tell that story, we start to, grow and strengthen our recovery communities. Everybody has specific different pathways of recovery. And when we start to share about ours, we also start to say that, hey, this works. Even within recovery communities, there are little silos. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, that doesn't work. We're attached to what works for us. But once we start to build empathy and trust with those community members, and they see that maybe um, our pathway that was different still works, still had the same outcome of hope and resiliency and empowerment and strength and all the good feels, they're like, oh, well, maybe that does work. And that starts to strengthen the recovery community. It's not, infighting, if you will. It starts to say that there's space for everyone and life is happening and recovery is happening. Recovery is possible. And so we start to strengthen those communities. A lot of where we tell a story, of course, could be, within our communities, hanging out, having coffee, learning about each other, but also too, we have to think about the community in general, the public, and what the public perception is. So if I'm talking to a person in recovery and I say, hey, I'm in recovery, and they're like, oh, I get it. I'm in recovery too. It may not be the similar pathway of recovery, but they have a sense of, right? They have a sense of, they have a slight understanding of what has happened and, now, what's going on in life because I've made a change. But the public, people that aren't in recovery may not immediately know someone in recovery. They have a different perception. They have a different view on things. And so that's where we start to think about or come across and bump against these types of stereotypes and biases. People thinking that, oh, when somebody identifies as alcoholic in recovery, that they're still struggling, that they're um, some someone's struggling with a paper bag and sloshing around in the streets and can't really walk straight. No, that is oftentimes a misconception because of what they have grown up with or what a bias is in way of understanding. So we start to shift these views within our communities, within society, not from that drunk or that druggie in the street and very skid row, but we start to see societal views change into positive, right? We in that old perception, in that old view, we attach moral judgment to that. We start to judge people's morals, values, characters. Oh, well, they're making a choice to. No. When we start to shift those societal views, we start to say, oh, those folks might need some help. They're living with a substance use disorder and it being a brain disease. We need to be able to gather the resources or point individuals to the resources so that they can start to get help and get on the other side of that. So already there in changing that perspective, from a moral failing to living with a disease, we start to see that shift, right? They don't want to help you. Oh, you need help. Let's see what we can do. And so we start to see this public perception change. There are a lot of case studies of successful public perception campaigns, anti-drug campaigns, or anti, um, this or that. But what really grows, what's really attractive, is those recovery campaigns, those hope campaigns, if you will. If we constantly focus on the problem, we're always going to be focused on the problem. But what if our perception changed, our view changed, and we started focusing on the solution? We stop saying, I can't, you can't, they can't. We start saying, we can. We can, we do. Recovery is possible. You too can recover. You too can get help. We start to eliminate those barriers, because those perceptions are barriers to people getting well. And we start to implement those ideas of solution, those resources for getting people help. It's not just the community, the public, the folks that may not have an immediate contact or immediate touch with someone with substance use recovery or in substance use recovery, but it's also to those um, policymakers, the folks that can implement change. If they have this old view of Skid Row, blah blah blah, then of course that's going to impact the decision on how they pass or don't pass any types of bills. So those decision makers, um, if their perception is that of um, old, stigmatizing, hurtful, misunderstood, misconception, then of course their decisions are going to be made with that in mind. So this is why it's super important that we tell the story that people do get better, not just to our community members, but to those policy makers as well, so those decision makers as well. Giving real world examples of advocacy success, we can look back, at least here in the States, in America, where we as a recovery movement came together and started to come out about our recovery and saying, hey, recovery works, you should invest in it, you should invest in recovery community and recovery community organizations, invest in the solution, not just looking at the problem. And we were able to pass the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, CARA. And that made a huge change for recovery community organizations across the United States, allowing them the support and the financial support and funding to be able to carry their mission forward. And that mission was to, carry that message that recovery is possible, and we're here to help, and we get it. And when we start to mobilize our storytelling, it starts to influence that legislation. No longer are they talking about drug abuse or using words that continue to stigmatize and paint this old world picture. They start to use different language. I can think of a few different organizations that have had a lot of advocates talk about, what it would look like if we were to change our language. And the Bureau of Justice Assistance had a comprehensive opioid stimulants and substance abuse program, COSAP, COSSAP. and through a lot of advocacy and a lot of um, you know talking about and telling the story that when you say abuse, picture is painted, and from that picture, um, funding is either denied or supported. And when we start talking about abuse, we are talking about somebody that is having a moral failing, that they are abusing it. Now, when you change the word from abuse to use, and we talk about substance use disorder and brain diseases, then we start to focus on the problem, start to give a hope shot. So, with the Bureau of Justice, they changed this language because they heard their community, they heard the constituents, they heard folks like us telling that story that recovery is possible, and this is a disorder. They changed the name to Comprehensive Opioid Stimulant and Substance Use Program, OSUP. And so that's an example of how just telling our story and being out about recovery and giving that shot of hope, um, that it starts to make an impact. We start to mobilize our storytelling, and we do so in just a manner that makes us focus on the positive change, and highlighting those areas that starts to make change at those levels. Even highlighting community change starts to impact policy change. When we start to see communities that are supporting recovery in and not just saying, not in my backyard, you're not going to bring a treatment center or a recovery residence or a recovery community organization in our backyard. When those stories start to change within our communities, and they and communities start to say, oh yeah, we love our recovery community organization that's in our community. We support them all the time. We love the work that they're doing. Then that starts to make impact at a policy level, because those folks that may not have a close connection to people in recovery, they start to see that recovery is possible because the recovery community is in their neighborhood, and they're like, oh wow, this is not at all what we thought it was. This is awesome, and we want to see more of this, and we want to see them thrive. And when a policy or um, some legislation comes up around the topic of supporting recovery and recovery support services and all that jazz, those people that previously didn't know anybody now know somebody, now know that recovery is possible, and that recovery community organizations or recovery support services that are happening within their neighborhood, within their backyard, that they need the funding, and they vote in a way that supports that. So now we start to see how that starts to impact policy change within our communities as well. The dance, come on, clicker. There we go. I tell you, technology, sometimes you got to talk sweetly to it, because I believe it's listening, and it will be a little stubborn, like we experienced this morning with our audio. We talked about the community members. We talked about policy makers, decision makers, and now we start to talk about our strengthening of our peer support networks. So we know that recovery and peer recovery support services make a huge impact. And one way that we start to actually build and strengthen our peer networks is by telling that story, telling the story that peer support works, and we should be investing in that. And when we start to talk about, I'll use myself for an example. I'm a direct product of peer recovery support services. I never went to a formal inpatient treatment. I did go to detox and receive clinical services there, but when it came to after detox, after those 5, 7 days, um, I went to a residential recovery center where the focus primarily was on peers helping peers, people in recovery helping people in recovery. And immediately from day one, met people that got it, that get it. That when I start to talk about feeling helpless and hopeless and that I'm broken, that somebody sat across from me and said, "Yeah, dude, I get it." And they really did because they lived it as well. And they were there to tell me that, that is what you might be feeling now, but stick around because that changes. I heard that in recovery circles, a little phrase, bear with me. First, in recovery, first life gets real, and then it gets different, and then it gets really different. And for me, that connection, hearing that from a person that had a lived experience that was a peer themselves, that encouraged me to stick around and see how life started to change. We start to create some deep and supportive connections. Sometimes our family members, they won't get it. We can tell them um, a little bit about our substance use history, and they will clutch their pearls and oh my goodness, I can't believe you did that. And then here comes the shame, here comes the guilt that I feel just from that. Oh my goodness, I can't believe you did that. But if we tell somebody in recovery, they're like, oh yeah, I totally get it. I get that. I've done that. I've seen that happen. And we start to build up this rapport. We start to build up this supportive connection, and we start to help one another. And in that comes that mutual support effectiveness, where people that may not have had similar experiences, where we may feel detached um, from them, we start to feel a sense of community and connection from those that have had or shared similar experiences and sometimes been in the similar places. Maybe it's not just focusing or talking about substance use, but maybe it's about um, having to navigate the system of care and how difficult it is. And using the conversations from peer to peer to say, yeah, I get it. Trying to get assistance with transportation could be difficult because you have to fill out this paperwork and talk to this person and blah 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 blah. And they get it because they've gone through those systems, those same systems of care. And they might have learned a thing or two along the way. And that's where we start to benefit that mutual support. They're like, yes, yes, hang on though, because, if you keep up with it and keep up on the radar, then, we get to move things forward, but don't lose hope because, it's just right around the corner. It's just two more filing of paperwork, or it's the appointment's just right around the corner, and hang on for that. And that gives a shot of hope within managing systems of care as well. Now, when we start to talk about professionals that may be in recovery, like clinicians, social workers that may be in recovery, at least here in the States, um, there are some ethical guidelines that we need to consider, because we can't just go out and tell our story to those that are that we're charged with supporting. Um, it has to be intentional, and it has to be. We have to make sure that we're not just telling a story, just tell a story, just to build a rapport. And also, too, we have to keep in mind the level of protection and confidentiality and privacy that happens within those clinical settings. We have to make sure that we do no harm. And sometimes our stories, I don't know about you all, but I've had a very colorful um, uh, substance use active, running and gunning history. And telling those stories might trigger somebody. I always think about some of the videos that, post a little, disclaimer, trigger warning, or, this this movie, this story involves blah 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 blah. So it gives you that preface. But when providing clinical services, we need to make sure that as clinicians or social workers, that we are, because we are clinical workers or social workers, we are bound to specific ethical guidelines. And one of those things are, of course, do no harm, just like peers have that guideline. And knowing that um, our story can cause harm, can be triggering. So making sure that we are aware of and intentional of, and are asking ourselves, why am I telling this story? Why am I, what's my intention? What do I hope to get across? Am I telling it just to say, oh yeah, I'm cool. I have lived experience too. So oftentimes I tell people to wait, WAIT. Ask ourselves, why WAMI talking? Wait, why am I talking? Why am I going to tell this story? And that helps me to think about and consider my purpose, my intention of telling the story, or telling, self-disclosing about my recovery path or whatnot. And also puts me in a place of like, okay, would this be a triggering story? Would this be harmful? Uh, would it be harmful if I self-disclose? And also having accuracy and truthful representation. I'm not going to tell, a story, um, or make up a story, I should say, just to get a point across. I'm going to, be honest and truthful. And so that speaks to not just ethical guidelines, but also to maybe personal values, and being honest, and um, in my representation of myself and what it means to be in recovery. It's not all sunshine and roses. I don't have to, share all the triggering stories, but I can tell the person that it's not all sunshine and roses, and there will be difficult moments. And that's truthful. That's honest. And for any recovery pathway, recovery journey, there will be bumps in the road. And I'm not going to paint a pretty picture just to sell this process or this pathway of recovery. I'm going to be honest, and also uh, make sure that I'm not hurting the individual when I self-disclose. We talked about um, clinicians, our community members, our decision makers, and also how we approach telling our story to somebody that we're serving. We want to make sure that we do have um, buy-in. We do have, um, we're including people into that step storytelling process. And that is, first things first is getting their consent. Can I tell you a story? Can I share something with you? That's getting consent from the individual. Because of course, if they're not in the place to hear that, then we're just telling a story to hear ourselves speak, to tell our story with no real motivation. If the person isn't listening, then the person's going to be shut off. So we need to be able to get them to engage, and first things first, getting a consent, obtaining informed consent clearly. So whether that in a formal setting, that people know that they're speaking with a peer or working with a peer that is a person with lived experience, able to provide peer recovery support services, and during that duration of time in receiving services, the peer may self-disclose in a um, in a uh, and then a word that's escape me, in the right setting, will disclose, part of their story, share a part of their story, with their consent. And in those settings, in those more formal settings, it may be like that may be the disclaimer in all of the paperwork. But it also might be like, hey, peer to, person receiving services saying, hey, throughout the time that we're together, we'll probably come across a point where I've shared or I've had a similar experience. And I'll ask you now, and I'll ask you then if I could share some of that experience with you. Respecting the storyteller and the autonomy and control over that. As everybody has a different pathway, a different experience with their own journey of recovery, and it's personal, it's intimate, and being able to respect that as a storyteller, as a peer providing recovery support services. Of course, I want the respect, but also too, I have to remember that the person receiving services also has a story to tell, and they may not have the guidelines to give us that trigger warning. But being able to navigate those conversations where we are respecting them telling their story, and also being able to help navigate them um, through that story, so that they're not just focusing on the negative. And then also thinking about the ethical considerations and our responsibilities. So if the person that is receiving services is telling us a story, and they tell us something that we have to report on, then we have to tell a storyteller, we have to tell the peer receiving services that for my role, I may or may not have to share this with my supervisor. And the supervisor may or may not raise that to board of directors or to the next level of decision making sure that the person that is receiving services, that if they disclose XYZ, they know that I have to report. And that we can also mention at the beginning of receiving services when we start talking about consent. We can say, and should you share with me that you are going to hurt someone else or yourself, please know that I am required to share that with my supervisor. I have to report that. I have to note that. This way, this person knows that that is kind of the foundation of a working agreement together. Come on, technology. There we go. So as we start to talk about telling our story, we also have to talk about navigating some of those risky areas. Um, how do we identify emotional and psychological risks? Again, thinking about WAIT, WAIT, why am I talking? We have to think about what those emotional and psychological risks are for the storyteller. Sharing can be vulnerable. Um, Information can be difficult. So not just as the listener will we have that trigger warning, but also too for that storyteller. On any given day, it could be a horrible day. And what I'm used to sharing my story a lot. in public settings. And, I'm cool with it. It doesn't really phase me, but I can have that horrible day and I tell a part of my story and it just hits and it hits deep. Um, and knowing that that may come up and what safety precautions or aftercare that I put into place so I, the storyteller, can get support. So developing those support strategies like, hey, I tell my support network I'm about to share my story, or and I have shared my story with so and so, and a lot of stuff came up that today just hit really hard, and getting that support for ourselves, whether that is individual therapy, whether that is talking with a 12-step sponsor or your best friend or your partner, whatever that looks like, getting that support that's needed. And that's part of advocating for ourselves as well. Also, if we are working with individual receiving services and they are the storyteller and something pops up within them, being able to, as a peer providing services, provide some of those follow-up resources and support. Say, hey, you know what, you just shared something really deep and I want to make sure that we just don't end the conversation here. Can I follow up with you a little bit later on today to check up and see how you're doing? Here's that consent. Can I follow up with you? Right. And even, sharing some resources or even asking, hey, you know what, you just shared something deep. Is there somebody that you can touch base with and get that support? Also, too, you mentioned thus and such. Can I help get you resources on that? So making sure that some of those things are in place before we start to, move on and move away from that storytelling incident. Give me 1 second. I'm going to clear my throat. Thank you very much. And not just moving from there um, in managing storytelling risks, but also too, how are we to the public painting a picture or telling a story where it's not just a copy and paste um, uh, pathway of recovery or journey of recovery or the same old story. We thought we need to think about why it's inclusive. It's important to be inclusive um, and hear diverse stories, making sure that at least for a Latin individual like myself, if I never heard a story, a recovery story of hope coming from a Latin person myself, and I always heard the same story coming from the same type of people, same community, then I may not believe, I may not find hope that a Latino like myself um, has an opportunity to get well. So making sure that um, representation from diverse communities and that we're hearing in our community those diverse stories and hearing the recovery pathways from those the diverse communities that we're making sure that those are visible as well, highlighting some of those intersectional identities and experiences. So where I may be different here and I may be different here, I that becomes a part of my story as a cisgendered gay male who's also Latino. Will that story would be different from a cisgendered gay male who is white. So some of those things need to be considered when we tell our stories and how we highlight some of those areas or those differences when we tell our stories, because it may encourage other people, you know, you know, to tell their stories, or they find hope within those stories. So it's very important to be able to listen to and encourage folks from different backgrounds to include their storytelling. Now, we tell our stories, of course. I'd like to say we communicate in three different ways. Verbally, what we say; non-verbally, all the things that we do within our face or mannerisms, those non-verbal cues; and paraverbally. Paraverbally is the tone and cadence of how we tell our story. I can tell you, oh, I'm having a wonderful day today. The tone and cadence says, hey, he's having a wonderful day today. I can say the exact same statement, oh, I'm having a wonderful day today. And then you hear something different. You hear sarcasm. You hear that maybe I'm not having a wonderful day today. But we also communicate via social media. So using whether it's social media or even our newsletters and that type of media. How are we telling those stories while using media? Developing impactful key messages. So we can say that in my communication, I'm having a wonderful day today. If we were to put that into a newsletter, wonderful would probably be a bold, italicized, word that sticks out to make impact. When we say Happy Recovery Month, that's going to be bold. That's going to have impact. When we say recovery is possible, recovery happens in our newsletters or in our social media posts, those are going to be probably, first letter, all caps, bold, exclamation marks everywhere, emojis, oh, the emojis that we can go with. But how do we develop those impactful key messages in our media? And what are those effective strategies to interact with different types of groups, different types of social media groups, or different types of groups that consume social media, and maintaining the authenticity and integrity? So if I told a story to a specific age group, I would probably tell the story different than I would to maybe a youthful age group. I may use different slang or words that they themselves use, and consider that in our social media impact as well. Who are the demographics that we're reaching? Who are the people that we're reaching and talking to? So we know with Facebook, it might be 40 and up. TikTok, it might be between the ages of 20 and 30. Snapchat. My niece and nephew, they use Snapchat. My nephews, and they are in their teens and coming out of their teens as well. So the story is going to be different, and how we consume knowledge. If I went on and on and on in a story, if it went past 5 minutes, we've lost my attention. So knowing that, how we hone our story, how we cater our story to make an impact with different types of communities, different groups, is very important. Handling challenging questions. This reminds me of an instance, and here's the story. In my early recovery, the residential recovery center that I received services for, and later went back to volunteer, and then later was employed by, the executive director said, okay, we have a news crew coming and they want to hear about legalization of such and such. And I want you to instead not talk about the legalization of thus and such, but talk about a solution and highlight the importance of funding recovery support and recovery support services and recovery community organizations. So it was a pivot here in handling challenging questions. So I got thrown in front of the camera, and I had to make sure that I didn't have any wild and crazy slogans that only the members of my specific 12-step community that I was involved with that only they would know, and making sure that I was able to process and pivot and do this dance with reporters where we were able to handle challenging questions. So the question comes at me, what do you think about the legalization of less and such? And I'm like, well, you know what? I think I have a lot of things and ideas around the legalization of less and such. But what I really want to focus on is recovery and recovery support services. Because no matter what happens with legalization of less and such, recovery will still be needed. Recovery support services will still be needed, and they're dangerously close to, not being accessible. And I want to talk about how we can start to fund, how we can start to promote, how we can start to be excited about what's happening in our communities in places like this, where people find a new way of life. Boom. It went from not talking about the problem to talking about the solution. And I used the platform that they gave me, that they provided. Now, whether they used all of that material or not, that's a different story. But being able to take that challenging question and pivot it. So using those strategies for redirection and how we kind of pivot to start to focus on the solution. And even having prepared responses and maintaining composure. I know that in some forums, legislation will open up the floor and start to hear from the community. But you have only 1.25 minutes to, it may not be that short, but you have such a short period of time to make a honed pitch or tell a very abbreviated story that's impactful, that makes those decision makers think twice about what they, what policy or bill or what you have presented to them. And so having those prepared responses and maintaining composure. So that means if you're not a public speaker and you really want to get involved, it may take some practice to get that composure and maintain it, especially in a crowd of decision makers or just a crowd in general. So being prepared with some responses and even practicing, and how we manage difficult public interactions as well. Oftentimes we might see a movie where, the protagonist is walking through a crowd of, reporters, cameras are snapping. Oh, no further comment, no comment here. How do we interact with those public interactions that may be difficult? And that might be being able to, another case or instance where we have those pre-prepared responses and how we maintain our composure. And, sometimes some of the things that we advocate for, they don't pull through. And so we might be interviewed on our stance for that. And it just might be maintaining that composure and being able to say, oh, it's unfortunate that such and such was not supported and this didn't move through. And we would like to work with our legislation or our decision makers or our community leaders and how we can help their goals and our mission to advance recovery and recovery support services, and how we can work together with these instances. So again, we use kind of a pivot. We still kind of eke in um, our goal and start to move forward. I hear a little bit of.
You got
Yep,
about 10 minutes left, Joseph. About 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Sounds good to me. I can talk about this for 10 minutes and 10 hours. I'm so passionate about it. So we talked about practicing. And great, if you can practice in front of a mirror, that's fantastic. I always like to practice in front of, people that I know so I can get some honest feedback. And so we start to craft this message for certain situations or for certain audiences, and we need to make sure that it's concise and that it's impactful. Why am I talking? What's our motivation? So having techniques for active listening and thoughtful responses. I've been in settings where somebody has asked a question and they don't answer it at all. They don't redirect at all. Um, it's just like they're having two separate conversations. And that's because they weren't listening actively to what was being asked. Instead, they're waiting for their turn to talk. So honing those active listening skills and redirecting skills, so it becomes like a 1-2 punch, right? You ask me a question, I'm like, yes, I'm going to repeat back the question to you, and then I'm going to redirect by telling you what I want to tell you. That might be some of those skills that we employ, some active listening, or even utilizing active listening as the segue. Oh, yes, I heard you talk about this, and funny that you mentioned this because this is what's happening in our community, and this is why recovery needs to be funded. See how we take what they are saying and we do a quick little move, and we use that energy to move our mission or goal forward in our storytelling, and then maximizing discussion and those opportunities within our communities. We should absolutely start to hear from one another. So talk about building out some panel discussion opportunities so that we can hear the different views, but also to be able to respond to those different views or those different perspectives. Panel discussions, much like Q&A sessions, anticipating and preparing for audience questions. Again, active listening, making sure that you respond to the question, but also too, if it's a difficult question, how to respond to that. Just like my example of the interview, being able to prepare for that question. I knew I was going to be asked what I thought about, legalization of this and such, and I knew how to respond. And having that effective response and that boundary setting strategy. I don't want to talk about the legalization of this and such, but I do want to talk about that was a boundary setting. I don't want to talk about this. I do want to talk about this. Facilitating productive discussions. Being able to manage this art and say, yes, we do want to talk about this, and we can talk about that all day. What we're here to do, why we're here today is to talk about this, this, and this. And we would like to know your opinion on this. And who's our next speaker? So it's a lovely dance, and it takes a lot of honing those skills, especially facilitating those skills, to facilitate those conversations within our communities. Some storytelling modalities might be some written narratives, some memoirs, blogs, spoken word or oral storytelling, digital storytelling. Of course, we start to think about storytelling in just one platform, but there are many, many ways to tell our story. Again, who is your audience? What is your intention? And what message are you trying to present? Thinking about how we practice those areas I wish I had a pointer to, point to these, 3 bullet points, but thinking about how maybe we're in a written platform, we don't have a audience to practice with, but we can share what we've written with our trusted few and say, how does this land with you? We're living in a world of artificial intelligence, and sometimes we could bounce that narrative or that story off of that AI if we don't have that select um, network where we can bounce things off of. And with digital storytelling and podcasts, pairing with those, a lot of people like to tune into podcasts and think that things just naturally occur. Now, we have questions, we have ideas, we have stories that we want to tell in the process of that podcast, in the process of that conversation, and making sure that we're prepared for that and the responses that we get with that. Innovative storytelling approaches. What we've been starting to see nationally is storytelling through social enterprises. You know, organizations that have something to say, and they happen to, be selling this product. For example, we think about sometimes the Goodwill here in the States. The Goodwill not doesn't just sell clothes that have been gently used previously, but they also help individuals, and that is what they focus on, and that is what Goodwill is known for in a lot of different ways, in different areas, and for the job opportunities for those that had struggled in the past as well. So even when you show up to a Goodwill, you'll most likely engage with somebody with lived experience in some fashion or another. And that is an excellent way to tell a story through that enterprise. Even on unconventional platforms and methods, thinking about, billboards or bus wraps, how those tell stories as well. And they start to generate engagement within the community. So those different strategies that we are able to um, tell that message, tell that story, but also the recovery campaigns that we start to see within our communities as well. When we start to leverage media for advocacy, this is, I tell you, this is why public relations is so important. Unfortunately, public relations within our organizations, that is the first thing to go if we had to, do some cuts. Well, we need to be mindful that those public relations, they're going to have their finger on the pulse of what is happening in the community, and they are going to have strategies to be able to respond and respond timely. Thus and such comes out on the news, and here's an opportunity to not only talk about what just happened, but to say that, in our community, this doesn't happen, or we provide resources for this to never happen in our community, and this is why recovery is important. Here's some just willy-nilly examples, but making sure that we are listening, keeping our ear to the ground for those opportunities to amplify those recovery messages, amplify those stories, success stories within our community, and be able to give um, examples of successful messages to in those cases where it's a quick turnaround. Much like inclusivity and diversity, we want to make sure that we are culturally humble in our storytelling. So thinking about and respecting all and navigating all cultural differences, that when we tell our story, we're telling our story across diverse populations, because it's impactful across all age, gender, you name it. It is substance use disorder impacts and is not discriminant as to who you are, where you came from, and therefore those recovery stories are the same. You know, all of those folks get support in recovery as well. The international perspective, of course, there is going to be a cultural impact and influence. So where here in Denver, Colorado, where it's very, very progressive and very young and hip with all our colleges, my story is going to be significantly different than, say, your story across the globe, you know, and how it impacts, because you know your audience, you know what words and what phrases and what will impact or make an impact in your community. So, you know, making sure that you have keep that in mind. So what might be said in a 12-step circle in the United States may absolutely have no impact somewhere else in the world. So being aware of that and making sure that we are culturally responsive and be able to tell those stories in many different languages, in many different ways, but also too keeping in mind that we're focusing on and what we're focusing on, that is recovery and recovery being possible and people in recovery being awesome, resilient human beings.
Hey, Joseph, if you could wrap it up in about a minute so we can get to some questions too.
Yep, absolutely. So we talked about our trigger warnings, but also too, you know, making sure that we are trauma informed. And there are many different trauma informed trainings out there, but in storytelling spaces, making sure that we are aware that not just the space, but the story can make for a hostile and traumatic experience for someone. So making sure that we keep that in mind and we tell our story in a trauma-informed way, and how we facilitate those best can be learned in a lot of those trauma-informed trainings, and ensuring that there is, again, some aftercare, some emotional safety for storytellers and the listeners as well. So what we want to do is make sure that we have self-care for storytellers, that it's in place, that they get their support, and you know that we're able to tell our stories even more. And one way to do that is getting that support and to be able to remain resilient and sustain our recovery messaging and storytelling. Always resources. You can reach out to ISSUP for a lot of that continuing education, what's new in the fads, and as times change, and getting those resources and continuing education, what we say, what we don't say these days, and making sure that we keep our stories relevant, because our story being told in the 1990s versus now in 2025 is going to be considerably different. So making sure to keep up to date with that. Here are our key takeaways, and I'll let you read those as we start to call for some questions.
All right. Where am I here? Sorry, I lost myself in my script. Joseph, thank you so much for that incredible and thoughtful and powerful presentation. And we're going to have some time for some questions. There were several people that put some in the question box. Feel free to continue submitting questions using that box as well. So the first one that came through, which wasn't a question, but I found intriguing, and I love your how this kind of affected you, was it was from Magda, and telling stories about themselves helps them visualize their self-perception in relation to others. And I thought that was a really good comment. I'd love for you to like kind of, how does that hit you? That you get to, through you telling your story, you get to visualize your self-perception in relation to others.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know, and I'm personally intimate with my own personal journey pathway of recovery. And when I start to listen to others, I start to think, because I can get lost in, my pathway of recovery. But then again, I've been in recovery close to 20 years now. So I am not as close to that lost use and that that experience. Like I mentioned, times have changed. New substances are out there. New ways of doing things are out there, and so I get to listen and to see and hear what might be some new struggles or new approaches to recovery. For a long time, especially my early days of recovery, I was so staunch in one way of thinking and one way of doing things until somebody challenged me. And so I am able to keep my experience into perspective and say, okay, this is the way I've done things, but it's not the only way. And if I listen actively, I can see that there are other things happening. And I can put that gem in my pocket. And when I listen to somebody next, I could say, hey, you know what? I heard this story. And maybe that's something that you could try, right? So they're always gems. So I like to put my perspective to one side and challenge myself and say, okay, this isn't the only way to do things. And that, quite honestly, is how we advocate for change as well, is giving those folks gems of new ways of doing things.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Joseph. This one just came through, which I kind of hit me because I've heard this quite often. I'd love to hear your experience. Manuela, they said, is it common for a storyteller to feel re-traumatized?
Absolutely. And this is a part of that. If you can think back to the slides around some of the risks of telling the story. I have worked with, and some of my dear friends are survivors of a lot of traumatic experiences. And, early on in their recovery pathway, they wanted to share that. And they were empowered by the work that they had done, whether it was with their therapist or with their sponsor, and they didn't relive that experience. They released that experience. But that doesn't mean that, again, like I had mentioned, they have a horrible day and they're telling their story and it just pops up. So being aware that, yeah, trauma can pop up. We can get re-traumatized. What are we putting into place? But also, too, being mindful that, hey, I'm about to tell my story. This is the audience, and this may happen. And what do I do with that? And if, depending on what setting, we can be vulnerable with people and say, hey, you know what? I did not expect that to come back up again. Please give me a minute. Or, being able to set that boundary and say, I want to move away from this topic, but give me a minute here to recollect myself. And in a different setting, how we pivot away and say, you know what, my story from each time that I tell it can hit me a different way. And today, it hit me in this way. And thank you for your time if we're talking to like legislators or decision makers. And thank you for your time. And just know that without the recovery support services or without recovery, they wouldn't have even been able to stand in front of you today.
Yeah, awesome. Let's see, another one from Hiderman. For all foundations, and especially for those dedicated to substance use recovery, it is extremely important to have effective storytelling. I've told my story in safe spaces and recovery spaces and public spaces, and so how do you have solid storytelling? Like, what's kind of bulleted points of having an effective storytelling?
Yeah, I think this goes back to a lot of at least my experience in 12-step circles and in telling, the little three parts of the story: what happened, um, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. Um, Now, what I don't focus or don't put too much weight on is, you know, back then, the old running and gunning days. I don't put too much emphasis on the use and the hopelessness and the helplessness, because I can say hopelessness and helplessness, and you can feel that, you can understand that. It's just how the inflection of and where I pause and be able to make that an emphasis. It felt helpless, it felt useless, broken, and that makes an impact without having to go into, oh, I was, shooting blah 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 and 20 times a day, and because that makes no impact. But talking about, those feelings that people can empathize with, and talking about and focusing on some of those solution parts. And at that point where I felt at my absolute bottom, like there was absolutely no hope, there was somebody in recovery that reached out and said, "Hey, you want to get some help?" And it was that point that I made the decision to make a change, and that was the best decision I made.
Awesome. Thank you, Joseph. So this question just came in, which points to a lot of what we speak about, especially in peer spaces, and not a lot, but it always pops up. So the question is, why is substance use seen as a disease instead of a result of wrong choices? Does this perspective not encourage wrong choices and make the individual shift all his actions to being out of his control?
Right. So, and that is a difficult one. So for a long time, um, the substance use disorder was seen as just a moral failing. You keep on making the wrong decisions. Um, there has been science. There's been science that's been done. There's been research that has been done that actually links substance use disorders to what happens in the brain. Now, we know that what happens in the brain once the substance, is admitted into our system, that there is that choice right before. And so it depends on how far away that substance has made some impact within our brain, that we don't have those repeat decisions, those broken systems within our decision-making process because of the brain disease. So it's understanding how the brain works, and also too, what happens in the process of recovery support services, or even therapy, where we start to create better coping skills or coping mechanisms, that we start to challenge old belief systems. And that is a part that starts to make a change before any kind of substance enters our body. When a substance enters my body, I know I'm running with it, and I'm no longer making decisions. I'm making decisions based on the chemical that's in my body. More, better, faster, now.
That's right. Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. So this one's from Amy, which is, it's tough, whatever space you're in, what do you tell, what do you not tell? So how do we get that balance right, where storytelling is open to all stories and not just those stories that are acceptable narratives of recovery? It feels like there's always a balancing act of balancing tolerable stories, ones that usually end with a positive outcome, and a bit more sanitized or listener friendly, I love that, versus stories that are potentially triggering and challenging, but are still meaningful and powerful.
Yeah, and so it is, it's knowing your audience. If I'm talking to a group of people early in their recovery process, they might have a little bit more of the color of that story. I may even use different language to help build rapport. But again, reflecting back to using some of those feeling words where people can empathize and get it. And sometimes I can tell my story where I lead the listener to drawing their own conclusion. You know, I can tell people, oh, there's my dog. I can tell people that I've done sort of things for drugs in the past, and I've sold substances, I've sold belongings, and at some points, I've even sold parts of myself and my self-esteem and respect. Now, I didn't have to go into the dirty details of, you know, what was done, but with telling you that I've gone to some low places and I've left a part or pieces of myself in those low places, we can still paint a picture for individuals without having to go into the re-traumatizing or traumatic details.
Awesome. Thank you, Joseph. And this kind of leads in as well, and this might be our last question here. But Jennifer asks, I see it so much like self-disclosure. What's the difference between self-disclosure and storytelling?
I think with self-disclosure, it can be a little bit uh, sterile. It could be, it could lack I mean, with storytelling, um, even the word itself, storytelling is, you know, you're getting comfy in your chair to hear story, right? And a self-disclosure can be a little bit more sterile in the sense of like, um, I too am in recovery. That's a self-disclosure. But if I'm telling you a story, then I'm telling you about like how or you know what that means to me. A self-disclosure can be very um, small, short, abrupt. It could be a simple sentence um, versus a story. You know, we're talking paragraphs, we're talking pages, we're talking novels. Imagine or compare a self-disclosure statement to a story, which can be found in like a novel or a book.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Comes with feelings. I might shed a tear if I'm telling a story. Probably not going to shed a tear if I self-disclose. All right. Awesome. Again, thank you, Joseph, for helping us continue this series with your experience in storytelling and how to best approach all aspects of storytelling in recovery spaces, public spaces, and beyond. And thank you to everyone for all of you being here today. So as we've heard today, and in this series, recovery is not a one-size-fits-all. It's shaped by personal experience, culture, access, and community support. As we continue this journey together, we invite you to reflect on how your work can honor and uplift those affected by substance use disorder. So you'll all receive an email, a follow-up email shortly with the webinar recording, the slides, additional resources. Please also take a moment to complete the short survey, feedback survey. We love your thoughts. And we're going to see you again in this time 1 week. I changed my script, it wasn't 2 weeks, 1 week, at the same time as we start our leadership development phase with Dispatch from the Front, lessons learned at the collision of public health, peer support, and a rising tide of hope. Until then, Thank you again. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.